Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to my talk entitled Elevating Your VR. My name's Tom Heath. I work for Oculus and I've been doing VR applications for about 2 years now, just coming up for a year at Oculus. And I'm a software engineer. I've been going in the games industry actually for about 20 years. And so software is my thing, particularly prototypes and demos. And that's something I've been doing at Oculus a lot of, trying out VR experiences, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and just sort of seeing what pushing all the boundaries, just discovering more about this virtual reality that we're all enjoying. So my talk today is it's very much a practical guide about for developers who are making VR experiences. Something we've discovered is that you can have very good VR, but there really is a difference between good VR and something that's absolutely stunning. It was mentioned in the keynote speeches actually very well, that sense of presence. And until you've actually felt it, until you've actually seen VR that's really excellent and it makes you really feel sort of in the back of your brain, I think the expression was, do you really feel like you're there? You get this special moment where, wow, that's incredible. And at the moment, and our own applications included, there were, for me even, for early days, I would do applications and they seemed great. And then there came a time when I would see something absolutely awesome, particularly with DK2. And once you've sort of recognized what it is that makes an awesome VR application, you then can never go back. Everything you've done beforehand has to be changed to sort of reach that plateau. And I've been, as part of my job, as I said, I do these prototypes and samples. It forms the best practice guide, informs the SDK team, which I do software for. And another thing I've been doing is developer relations on the technical side. So going to see other developers, seeing how they're getting on, learning from them as well, but also sort of seeing where we can make sort of small tweaks, sort of tighten up their VR. And often it's had a dramatic effect and elevated what could have been a good experience into something absolutely stellar. So key to this, and something we're finding, is that it's not always obvious for people to recognize in their own products whether it actually hits these this high bar for the components. So something I'm going to be talking about is how to recognize this level of quality that if you get it, you get this awesome sense of presence when everything's in alignment and you've hit all these components. Kind of like Brendan was talking about in the keynote speech. There are these components of VR, and when they all come in sync, it's awesome. So I'll be talking about how to recognize those, and also to further diagnose, if you find that you're not quite hitting as far as you could be on these components, how to diagnose that, and ultimately a few strategies on how to fix that. So I want to say a quick word about the difference between DK1 and DK2, because with the advent of DK2, with its great low persistence, we're now finding that you can see much more clearly, awesome 3D, awesome VR, but also you're aware of any small sort of deficits, any lack of timing, something that was perhaps not visible in DK1 because it had that motion blur that hid a lot of evils. So it's definitely a harder thing to do with DK2, but the results are so much better. In terms of the target audience for this talk, I tend to talk a lot about DK2 as the current thing, and also using our SDK libraries, the C API. But having said that, the content of the talk is applicable to mobile, to DK1 even. So just the general principles kind of apply across the board. Just to categorize things a bit, I kind of think of there's core VR on the one side, which is just creating this sense of sort of reality, if you like. So duplicating reality. So you put the headset on, you look around, does it seem real? Is everything tracking right? Am I immersed or have presence in this virtual world? And then separately to that is what I think of as developer VR, which is where it's the content that you apply into VR. So it's your VR component. You move through the world, what content you apply, how you apply it. And our SDK is very much supporting that core. So I'll deal with that first. Recognition then of what makes the great VR. And the number one thing that we find we come across a lot to varying degrees is having smoothness. it's like the first step, the sort of thing you really need. So when you're recognizing, how good is your VR experience, if you've got anything that isn't as smooth as you would expect, the 75 frames a second on a DK2, 60 frames a second on mobile, anything that doesn't match that expectation you have of that sort of frame rate as you turn your head, any juddering, any sort of double images, any stuttering, that's all, you don't want any of that, not even a little element. And sometimes it can be very subtle, everything looks good generally, but kind of deep down, no, that's not quite right. And it's just honing your product to be absolutely, spot on those things. What we're finding as well is that it's not normally just one issue that is creating this lack of smoothness. That's even once it's been recognized. There's multiple things, and you also find that it's very much the first thing that needs to be tackled, because a lack of smoothness and judder will actually hide a lot of the symptoms that then point towards the other things that you can enhance and you can tighten up in VR. The next thing is having correct prediction. Now, a few other talks have touched on this, but essentially we've got this sense of latency. Obviously, you've got a hardware system where you've got hardware components telling you the orientation of your head particularly, and there's a gap in time between when you render something based on that orientation and when you actually see the polygons on your face. So, that's known as latency, but also we bridge that gap very effectively with prediction. But it's important that it's the right prediction, because if that's off, then that manifests itself in just unreality, basically. So when the way to recognize this is when you smoothly move your head in VR. So I must emphasize, it's the smooth movements that show this. As you smoothly move around, sort of looking all around, you really have to expect and demand of your products that it actually is as immediate as you would think it should be. So you don't want you almost use your natural reflex, which you have, your brain will tell you, is that right, or is it lagging behind? Is there something amiss? So to recognize whether you've got the right prediction is all about smooth head movements, and it should be absolutely right there with you. Of course, the other side of that is the low latency. And to recognize the low latency, that is something which, because of the great prediction, only manifests itself on very rapid head movements. So I remember spending a very uncomfortable, well, basically don't do it the way I did it. I spent 2 days researching latency, and I was shaking my head back and forth. And it was only when I started getting this ominous crunching in the back of my neck that I kind of realized I should probably not be shaking my head like that. And in fact, a better way is to hold the headset and just shake it like that. And that will show you the effects of any latency you have. So look for vertical lines. That's a very good one to look for. So a vertical line in your VR world, shake the headset. How much does that vertical line move to really sudden movements like that? And it should move very little. That's our aim here. Something else to mention, which I mentioned in the last talk, in fact, is the latency tester for DK2, and that's built in. So if you want some actual hard numbers on this, then there is that facility available. But I like to think that after all the regardless of what the code says, if you can check it sort of directly with this method, then that's to guarantee that you're in the right place with your VR. Another thing is correct positional tracking. And this isn't just with the DK2, which has its external camera that helps you sort of positionally track your head. This is also for mobile and for DK1, where although we don't have an external camera, we do have a concept of positional movement. We use a head model where we effectively anticipate the kind of positional movement that you would get if you turned your head, and then we apply that in. So really what you're looking for is a one-to-one mapping with what you really would expect to happen corresponding to your movement. And again, don't settle for sort of anything less than that, because your brain isn't. And to get this sort of full immersion, this full presence, you kind of need all these things. Situations which promote recognition of whether your positional movement is one-to-one, go near surfaces in VR, so near walls, near the floor, anywhere where you've got something very much in your field of view, so you can let your brain's natural processes take over and judge it for you. Also, make sure that your VR experience is allowing the player to be within the camera view. This is for DK2. that you're not requiring too much movement that forever has the player going outside the camera view cone. Another big one is correct distortion. So all these ingredients are all needed, and any one of them that is out can destroy that sense of presence. So this is, again, there's that one-to-one mapping with reality. So when you're in VR, as you turn your head, as you look at anything, it should all sort of move past you exactly as you'd expect in the real world, without glitches, without anything strange. So if you have an object that's off to the side, and you turn your head so that you know it's there, you turn your head, and it should be where you think it is for the correct amount of turn. And if it's not, if there's a sort of swimming effect, if bits are coming in and out, nothing to do is if you roll your head like that, is there a twisting motion? Another very good cue as to whether you've got the right thing going on with correct distortion is to look at the chromatic correction that we do. So, have you got red lines and blue lines that are all showing you that the chromatic correction is not there, which, implies that nor is the rest of the distortion. Another quite subtle effect that you can get, I've called it flexing for want of a better word, but if you turn your head and you see a sort of distorted, sort of growing, expanding and contraction, it's quite subtle, a lot of these things are, but there again is something that, watch out for that one, because this is just in the act of a turn. If you see things expanding and contracting, that's something very specific, which I'll talk about shortly. Right, this is a big one. Stereoscopic 3D and and the IPD, which is the interpupillary distance, the distance between your eyes. Now, having stereoscopic 3D, so that is the different eye, you render different left eye and right eye images, and your brain fuses them together, gets the depth information. Having that is, obviously elevates an experience massively, and yet we're finding it's remarkably common to have experiences which just don't have it at all. There's been something's been left out, a coding bug, and yet because your brain is so keen to sort out, to interpret the 3D content, particularly very good 3D content where you've got lots of depth cues, and you're already filling in all the blanks. You think, oh yes, I recognize that image. That looks right. That looks in the right position. And what you could easily be missing is maybe either you don't have the right depth information, or you don't have any at all. It's a little bit. There is a rumor going around that actually Oculus themselves, we did show something at an event where it turned out afterwards it didn't have any 3D whatsoever. But we were all parading by, complimenting it, and I guess officially that never happened, but there is a rumor. So another thing is if you've got very large scale to your world, so you've faithfully kept one-to-one with the VR world that you've got, but actually everything is very large, so maybe the closest object's 20 meters away, in which case your natural sense of looking at two stereo images, if everything's to normal scale, is pretty limited to almost nil. So you might be going to all this trouble to render two images, and they're effectively the same. So just be really mindful. And the way to be mindful of whether you've got 3D, you kind of have to sort of force yourself to look, to consciously kind of sense the distance to things. The floor is often a good one. So in your VR world, kind of look down and, can you imagine where the floor is? So not just, oh yes, it looks right, but, how far do I really think it is? And can I convince myself it's a meter away or 2 meters away? And pretty quickly you can then say, yes, I think it's 1.5 meters away. If you find you can't, if you find it's very ambiguous, you probably have something going wrong there. And also there's this eye distance very much assesses how you're sensing the 3D. So it's different for different IPDs. We've grown accustomed to whatever our IPD is, and so what one person might judge as being a meter away, another one with a different IPD would judge as 1.5 meters away. So check that that's right, and in particular, the way to do that is to move positionally, move laterally or translate around the world, and does your movement that you're moving positionally, does that correspond to what you'd expect to happen in VR? Because if your muscles have told you I've moved a meter and it only is 0.5 meter in the VR world, then something's wrong. The IPD's wrong. So that's one. It just takes a bit of recognizing these things. I suppose no section on recognizing what really works in VR and how to attain that bar is complete without mentioning our SDK samples, where we've really tried to create a sort of set of benchmark, a sort of guaranteed piece of software where you can actually see these things in action. And I really encourage you to actually, having heard this about how to recognize these components, actually go and look at these samples, the Oculus Room Tiny and the Tuscany demo, and sort of see for yourself and try and ascertain, yes, can I recognize the high quality of these features in those demos? Because they're kind of showcasing how good this can be. I will say that it is a little bit early days. Occasionally you'll find some hardware which it won't provide this experience. In the fullness of time, of course, it will. But it is worth checking. Are you seeing these things? Is your hardware providing the VR experience that we think we're giving you? And a final, just while I'm mentioning SDK samples, it's a very good thing to actually use our SDK libraries, our functionality, because it's hard stuff, some of this. It's easy to make mistakes. We've made mistakes, and you've had to correct them, we've had to bug fix. And so, if you're trying it from scratch as well, granted, you'd probably do a great job of getting the 90% of the way there that's sort of readily available. But, to save yourself the extended period of bugs and things, wherever possible, use our libraries, and then we can save you the trouble. So, having recognized these parts of VR that really do elevate things, you kind of then, some of them need further diagnosis because it's not always clear, what's causing it, and of course you need strategies for how to fix it. What could be wrong? What do I need to fix up here? Smoothness being the big one. That, as I mentioned, that has multiple causes, and sometimes it's quite hard to unpick, which one you've got, which combination you've got. So you kind of, it's very helpful to be systematic in this. So one of the first things to kind of eliminate is, have you got the time warp working properly? Just to quickly say, time warp is basically the method of when you've rendered eye images to later on in time, effectively reorientate them to a better known head orientation. So what we strongly recommend here is you put a debug freeze function in, and it's present in our samples. And essentially what that does is it stops, instead of supplying a new two eye renders in a frame, it just freezes that. It doesn't provide any new eye positions, and it just lets the time warp, that reorientation correction, just work on its own. And so that way you can very much, and you can kind of see it's sort of in action there, really. And as you turn around, you see black emerging because you're not updating the eye image, but you also see that the eye image is in the correct place. And this unveils all sorts of obvious things once you do that, because it's a very subtle effect, time warp, very easy to have a bug in it. And so having something as obvious as this sort of helps eliminate that. I can't tell you the number of times we've actually, well, in my code as well, I have to be honest, the number of times where I've done this debug freeze function and found the whole time warp going completely in the opposite direction. So this great thing that was supposed to be fixing up, to make us absolutely smooth and low latency is actually the very thing that's derailing us because there's a simple bug in it. So this is really useful to have. And another thing we've been finding with developers is a slight tendency to turn off time warp. I guess because they're not seeing a perceived value to it, like seeing any difference. And this in every case where it's been turned off is because it just had a bug in it. So very much turn it on and have the debug functionality to get it working right, and then it's great. It really reduces your latency to really good levels. I will make a quick plug for when you're diagnosing these things, check the sample code, particularly Oculus Room Tiny, where we've sort of gone to some effort to make sure that all the function calls to the SDK in the right order are all in one CPP file, so you can follow it through. We've taken all the clutter out, so check that your flow of code mimics that one. You haven't missed anything out. Okay, another big one is maintaining the right frame rate. And this is so important because we've got this timing going on that tries to make sure that whatever you're rendering into the Rift is what is synchronized with, when those pixels actually arrive in your face, in your eyes, does that match the orientation that at the time. So this timing needs to be able to predict this, and that means we need to have a smooth frame rate. We need to guarantee the native display rate of whichever rift you happen to be on, or whichever device. So that's 75 frames a second on DK2, 90 for Crescent Bay, and 60 for mobile. And because at this point, we're only checking to see, we're trying to diagnose why we haven't got smoothness. So, just temporarily rip out that content. Just take out enough to guarantee your frame rate. And there are a couple of easy ways of doing this as well. You could use the Timewarp freeze functionality. So that kind of saves you having to render the eyes. So that should put most people under the frame rate. You could even render one eye if you wanted, because we're just checking smoothness here, and we're trying to diagnose what the problem is. Because when you have diagnosed it all, no matter how much content you've taken out, once you get that smooth and everything else working and all your VR sort of elevated to the level it could be, then once you've seen that, no matter what happens after that, you just don't want to do anything to disturb that. So sure, you'll be putting your content back in, but you'll be wanting to keep that awesome sense of presence that you've got. Profiles are always a good thing to see exactly what's going on, particularly as we oblige the GPU to finish before we go on to the next frame. And this is perhaps something that, not in VR, you're not used to doing. And so a scene where you previously thought, oh, that's easily within the right frame rate, suddenly with this GPU waiting, it's not. So just be really, really mindful that that is happening. Another cause for lack of smoothness, I mentioned there are quite a few, is having incorrect timing. Just pure and simple, just the code, the flow of the code isn't calling the SDK in the right order. So that's the first thing to check. Another thing which is really useful to do is have some sort of debug function to shift your prediction of timing away from the ideal that we believe and the SDK has provided you, just to shift it so it over-predicts or under-predicts. And the reason I recommend this, particularly if you're systematically trying to ascertain why you haven't got smoothness, is because you want to artificially put it to the lagging case. So have it under-predicting, lagging behind, because, okay, it looks horrible, everything lags behind you, but at least it's smooth. Whereas on the other side of things, if you're over-predicting, then that doesn't have the smoothness. So you're just eliminating one extra thing that it could be. Other things that could be causing your timing to be thrown out are your PC environments or other processes going on. If you're in extended Windows mode, are you full screen, or is VSync on? All these sorts of things. And generally, I know people say this, but having the latest graphic drivers is actually really important. I know people say that, and you think, oh, right, yeah, they're updated enough. Really have the absolute latest you can, because it makes a difference with the SDK. Just a quick example of incorrect timing. I went to a developer, and we had a sort of small sort of ghost image just trailing behind. So as somebody turned their head, you just see this sort of slight sort of doubling up and tripling up of vertical edges. And that was just purely, the Timewarp code within the SDK was expected to receive the orientation of when you rendered the eye, and they were just feeding in a slightly different orientation, so just something slightly out, just the slight wrong one, and that's all it takes to throw things out. Another cause of lack of smoothness, what we want to do often is, if you've got a bit of software that's running very quickly, and it's finished all its rendering, and maybe it's got 10 milliseconds left before VSync, which is a luxury, pretty rare. But if you've got any time left, and in that situation, rather than absorb that 10 milliseconds as just pure latency, it's better to just delay everything. So do your distortion pass, which has the time warp in it. Do it as late as possible. But with the best will in the world, you're trying to do that. You're trying to get that distortion to happen at the very last moment, but you can overdo it. And if you overdo it, you've missed the VSync, all your timing's gone, and you have judder going on. So the way to debug that, just to take it out, see what's going on, perhaps be a bit more cautious about how you apply it. Okay, so that's smoothness. So once you have smoothness, then you can start to look at these other things and really check whether you've got the right thing going on. So the correct prediction, are we saying that your head is going to get to this point by the time these polygons hit your face? So the debug function I mentioned, very useful. Because although the SDK has provided you with what we believe is the perfect, exact prediction, it's worth checking. Things vary. And also, so ascertain for yourself, set this debug function to underpredict, sort of identify that sort of lagging look where you turn your head and everything just follows with a slight delay. And then also recognize overprediction. So turn that debug value up, see overprediction happening, see how horrible it is. And when you come to tune it, so you're just trying to confirm that what the SDK is giving you is the right thing, the one that's really easy to recognize is the overprediction. That one just looks horrible and wrong. Be slightly more careful on underprediction, because that lagging situation is rather more, I don't know, I find your brain is rather more accepting of a degree of that. Particularly, actually, if you've got the rift on a bit loose, because the sort of rift slopping around your head actually sort of works in tandem with a lagging actually really rather well, so they kind of cancel each other out and it tends to look right. So tighten up that rift and then tune that, check it's all happening as it should be. As other debug options, you could remove time warp temporarily, of course, and you can check the flow of code again. So I'm plugging the Oculus from Tiny demo again, and you wouldn't guess I actually worked on it a bit. I don't think that's the last plug either. Maybe it is. So low latency. So that's something, it's good while you're in your code. It's good to try and just recognize it for yourself. So as I was saying, shaking the headset, not doing the neck brace thing. Just shake that and try turning time warp off. See if you can recognize that actually that evidence of latency increases. So it's good to satisfy yourself that you can see what's happening. And then, of course, to fix it up, time warp being on is something you should have. We have noticed a tendency, and I can understand the desire to do that, to avoid that GPU synchronization, to basically, instead of what we recommend, which is to synchronize that GPU so that it finishes and then you do the next frame, because it kind of hurts having to do that wait when you're trying to cram as much content in as you can. Be aware, though, that if you've done that, if you've taken out that synchronization and you've taken out that wait, you're pretty much guaranteeing you've got an extra 30 milliseconds of latency there. Also, you've probably thrown the timing out as well, because having that GPU sync there actually helps to sort of make the timing much more predictable. The just-in-time thing that I mentioned before, just to reduce latency, so wait to the last moment. And also use direct mode, which is use of our video driver. So that's there to kind of eliminate some of the built-in latency that some hardware has. And we're working on that all the time. So for the best result for how to bypass sort of some copies, things that your hardware is doing, direct mode's a really good thing to have. So correct positional tracking. So perhaps you've identified that things are not quite right. If you've got a mismatch between how your head's moving and what you're seeing in VR, then a common thing is that you've perhaps adjusted your IPD, which is a perfectly valid thing to do. You've artificially adjusted it to perhaps scale up your world or scale down your world or give a heightened sense of 3D-ness. And that's fine. But be aware that if you're scaling up the IPD, you've also got to scale up the positional movement, because then the two go out of sync and you get a mismatch and your brain doesn't like it. Also, check you've got correct transformations going on, because there's a lot of matrix maths going on. It's very easy to get something the wrong way around or in the wrong order. So what I'd recommend here, which is what I do, is just exaggerate all your inputs. So particularly the position. So the position reported by the SDK for your Rift, just multiply it by 10 or something. So, it's horrible because then everything's just diving around. But what it does let you do is just see, if I've moved my head round to here, then I've tilted over, then I've moved here, am I actually getting what I expect to have? So you get a nice exaggerated view, because a lot of things in VR are quite subtle. And so exaggerating things up generally actually is a good thing to do. I mentioned before that good positional tracking for DK2 is all about keeping your user in the view cone of the camera. That's getting them in the right position to start with, keeping them there, making sure the content doesn't make them go out, and then giving them a means to get back in once they've left it. I've just put a picture of sort of one of my perhaps more elaborate methods of keeping you in the view cone. That doesn't have to be quite to this extent, but there I've you're in the world. I've tried to keep somebody in the view cone. So they're in the world. They've, on the left-hand side, so they've slightly moved over into the edge of the view cone. So I kind of put on this sort of Stargate kind of portal sort of look. So it lets them know they're getting into trouble. I also, if you notice on the right-hand side of the left picture, it's starting to go to black because we don't want to put things in their face that are too close. And then once they leave the sort of VR sweet spot, actually I'm still within the VR tracking. And I kind of show a sort of hologrid thing. And eventually they're going to actually leave the view cone proper. But just be mindful of how helpful are you being to the users? Are you letting them sort of depart the view cone? Are you letting them get in trouble? Because as you depart from that positional tracking, everything just if they leave the cone, then it starts to break down their sense of presence. Okay, having the correct distortion. Now, perhaps not a particularly well-known thing is that the distortion within VR is dependent on your eye relief, so that distance between your eyeball and the lens itself. So this is something you're going to set in the profile, the config tool. So each person, it's different. And so if you have the wrong eye relief, then that's the wrong distortion for you. A way to quickly debug this and check it, quick and simple ways, you just grab the headset and just simulate, just pull it away, press it onto your face, see if there's another setting that works better. And if so, that'll be what it is, the eye relief being out. Also, check you've got the right profile coming through, because we haven't made it, and we're going to be doing it, we're going to make it more specific, more explicit about which profile's loaded in. So just be sure that for the moment, the right one that you're expecting is loaded in. Debug functionality, I think, is something that we're discussing. Can we just give you a slider so that you can vary live the eye relief, so you can just to help you debug? Another thing you might have done is perhaps calculate the field of view slightly in a custom way, perhaps, that isn't quite one-to-one with reality. As mentioned in the previous talk, your field of view is something that is kind of fixed. It's fixed to reality, really. So if you can see that much in the Rift, then that's your field of view. And if you're varying field of view, all you're really doing is clipping in or clipping this way. So check you do have that kind of correct one-to-one going on. And then I mentioned a very specific sort of flexing issue that you can have with distortion, this kind of rippling effect. What that's to do with, because it's quite clever what we're doing with Timewarp, we're not just reorientating the eye image, we're actually doing it across the eye view as it's rendered out, as the light sort of fills out the Rift. So there's one value for when it first starts rendering, one value of predicted orientation, and then nearly 13 milliseconds later, when it's finishing off the image on the Rift, the other end, it's a different number again. So if those have got confused or mixed up, that can generate this kind of ripple thing. So it's just when you're moving, it's quite subtle, but that will be something where you need to check the flow of your code, check the time warps implemented as it should be. So as I mentioned before, it's just such a big gotcha that we just find again and again. Is the stereoscopic view between the left and the right eye, is it right? And is it even there? So having a debug slider which lets you vary the IPD. So if you have 0 IPD, that's monoscopic, that's no stereoscopic difference. And have that varying from 0 to a reasonable value. And check that across your scene, you're seeing the sort of differences you'd expect. So in the far distance, you wouldn't expect it to vary. As things get closer, you'd expect it to vary proportionally. So just check it's there. And it's a good debug thing to have. If somebody's got their IPD wrong, as I mentioned before, there could be a scaling mismatch. You've scaled the world with the wrong IPD, and if you've got the wrong IPD in there, then your positional movements won't look quite right to a person using it. And another big one that we come up against every now and again is it's very tempting, because you've got different IPDs, different eye values, to try and move the center of rendering sort of correspondingly, to move it in and out. And basically, you never need to do this. It's something that was in the optic. The optics handle it themselves. So actually, no matter what your IPD, within reason, you always need to render the same place on the Rift. And not many of us actually believed this when we were first told it. So I was one of them. Everyone were told all this, and you could just see people just going back to their desks and just trying it out and moving it around and checking it's the right thing. But the optics take care of that. So in talking about resolving, getting to this awesome sense of presence, sort of elevating your VR to the highest it can be, I guess one of the biggest tasks, the tallest orders, if you like, is getting to that native frame rate. But it is so vital. So mentioning a few tools that you can use. There are some heavy-handed ones where you're adjusting your whole content, but some tools available to you. You can change the resolution of your eye buffers. This was touched on a little bit earlier in John Carmack's talk. It doesn't need to be that ultra-high resolution. It can be, you don't need one-to-one pixels with the center of the screen, because that inevitably, because of distortion, gives you an even higher than you need resolution on the edges. So it's very acceptable to go for less than one-to-one pixels. Reduce that resolution, see how it affects your content. Chances are it won't make much difference, and if your game is struggling with that, then that can make a huge difference. Something else you can do, it's built into the SDK, you can actually have a variable eye buffer resolution, so you can vary it on the fly, and that's a useful thing. That's built into the SDK already, so find the right switches and do that. Field of view is something else you can change. It's a shame because we've got this nice wide view. Why would you bring it in? But I guess some content maybe is more applicable. Maybe you can bring it down top and bottom. Again, it reduces the amount you're rendering, so it's an option. I've put monoscopic there, which seems slightly absurd after all the stuff about, oh no, people have got monoscopic and they haven't got any stereo. But for some games, or some applications, it's applicable, or it may be applicable. So if you say you've got a cockpit game and you've got the near cockpit and it's all gorgeously 3D and stereoscopic, but perhaps outside the cockpit, there's really no benefit to having it 3D, drawing everything twice. It could just as well be monoscopic. You could save yourself a lot of processing. A favorite of mine, actually, is alternate eye rendering, where you save yourself the cost of having to do these two eyes at this giant resolution, at this high frame rate. And you just do one eye per frame. And then you save the previous eye from the other frame and use Timewarp to help fix that up orientation-wise. So doing it as simplistically as I've just said has repercussions which are perhaps not great, in that if you positionally moved on from one frame to the next, that's going to manifest itself in two eye images that don't stereoscopically fuse. So you'd go a step further. You'd have a third eye buffer. You'd wait until you've created two images over the frames. You've created two images that are in the same position. They will stereoscopically match, and then you serve those up into the Rift. Another thing, well, I mentioned removing that weight. It's with a big caution flag, basically. I mean, some people are toying with that. It just has downsides. It throws your timing out, and it adds that latency. But it's up there with a question mark. The other thing I've found very effective is billboarding or impostering, or whatever other names people come up with it. Essentially, it's a tool to render large chunks of 3D geometry and then render them to a texture, and then use that same texture in the left eye and the right eye image. So you've saved yourself doing that twice. You can also, with more distant objects, not update that so often. So there's lots of savings to be had. And obviously, you can't do it too close to somebody's eye, because they're going to start to recognize that, if it's up close, oh, that's flat, doesn't work. But I think you might be quite surprised how readily that works. I've got a very good demo which runs about 10 meters away, and it's got the whole of the environment is split up into a series of billboards. And it works really well. So I save myself a chunk of processing time and allow my game to actually run in VR. OK, so that's kind of the core VR, and there are some big things there. I'm just going to touch on developer VR. So perhaps some big things that are happening, or things that happen quite often, that we've had had internally or that we're finding with developers that are perhaps the sort of biggest gotchas, if you like. Eye comfort is something we keep finding, that perhaps hasn't had the attention it perhaps needed. So allowing the user to get a bit too close to scenery, particularly because with the positional tracking that we do, we kind of invite it in a way because if you're in a cockpit, there's a chair behind you, you're moving around in the normal sort of zone, but it's very, very easy just to put your head back into the seat, for instance, or clip through scenery. So just be really mindful of that. Have you allowed some unpleasant sort of too close situations to arise? Have you got stereoscopically matching images? So are you making your brain sort of struggle a bit too much to fuse these two images because somehow they're not matching? They're too far apart, things are too close, a multitude of sins. Have you, a very bad one is, have you done something creative and you've obliged you're not happy with things at infinity where there's sort of no difference between the two eyes. You've gone a bit further and diverged them even more, and you require your eyes to actually diverge, which is very uncomfortable and not great. And finally, have you required your players to start moving their eyes in their sockets and sort of uncomfortably look around? Because in the real world, if we want to see something, okay, we kind of get the choice. We can either turn our eyes there or we can turn our head there. So if you're constantly obliging your players or your users to sort of look off into strange places, that can be very uncomfortable. So I recommend a debug tool. I seem to like doing that. So you can flicker your IPD from 0 to a sensible value, and you can kind of see where you've overdone it. Where you've got, all the scenery should flicker a little bit. This is viewing it outside of the Rift, so you can kind of debug things. Have you got things which are sort of moving, massively in the foreground? So it's a good general tool. If you've got things too close, at least clip them out. Limit, sort of Z-clip them out. So perhaps better to not see an object within about 20 or 30 centimeters, rather than just have it right up there, 5 centimeters away. And it's going to depend on your content a bit, but just being mindful of these things is really half of the battle, really. Can you fade out anything that's too close? Is there any way you can avoid the user sort of getting into that uncomfortable situation? For stereo matching, the best tool for sort of seeing if you've got these fusible images is just to let your eyes do their thing, really, and your brain do its thing. So just be very conscious of, how are my eyes feeling? So look at scenes, kind of relax your eyes. Is this a strain? And particularly, am I feeling comfortable? And when you come out of VR, do you have a sense of recovery afterwards? Like you've somehow had to recorrect for something. If you get that feeling, there's likely something wrong. If you want to test for if you're diverging the eyes, and it does happen, it's surprising, but these are big gotchas you want to try and stop. Just put a dot in the center of the view, and then just render a dot, the center of both views, and then look at your specific objects, and and you can manually kind of see, not in the Rift, you can see whether you're requiring the eyes to diverge. And finally, I said about trying not to make the user move their eyes in their socket, because we all have different distances we can move our eyes comfortably. So instead, particularly for head-up displays, sort of allow them to turn their head to see it. If you want to put items here, you're in VR now, so rather than just as they turn their head, it moves with you, and you're obliging them to look, just plant it in the 3D world, and then they can turn their head and have a really good look at it. Okay, another big one I just want to talk about, which comes up again and again and is perhaps a barrier to virtual reality games being the experience they could be, is accelerations within your game. And in particular, sort of accelerations that perhaps don't need to be the extent they are, or perhaps haven't been entirely thought through and could be improved. It is a cause of simulator sickness. I'd say it's the big one. It's any sort of accelerations, and just being aware of it is a big step in the right direction. You have some games they have to have it. So a car game, a driving game without any accelerations is going to get a little dull, I guess. So you have the linear accelerations, and you have rotational ones as well. Don't forget those. So if you're moving and you're rotating, that's just as much an acceleration. And the other one that perhaps people don't realize, it's kind of a quick movement, I suppose, but it's when you leave the view cone. When you stop being positionally tracked, it's like it's actually a movement to the player. It's like they were moving happily, sort of left and right. You know, their ears were telling them they were moving, the VR world's telling them they're moving, and then suddenly you lose tracking and they're not moving anymore, but their ears are telling them they are. So, you know, that's kind of another movement that you should be aware of. And again, we're finding, we understand that it's very much velocity dependent. So the more velocity is involved with these accelerations, the worse it's going to feel, and vice versa. So if you can keep things slower, you're helping yourself. So I suppose we've got a few good tools already where it's something we're actively researching. We want to find sort of catch-all solutions if we can. But at the moment, we've got some great techniques you can use. The first one is very ably described by my colleague Richard in the talk yesterday, but I'll briefly touch on it again. It's basically you've got this situation in your game perhaps where you're sort of moving through an environment, there's accelerations everywhere, it's perhaps not as comfortable as it could be. And there's this trick of where you convince your brain that it's not you moving, it's the world moving underneath you. And it doesn't even have to be at a conscious level. You don't really have to think, oh yes, I will understand that the world is moving underneath me. It's very much behind the scenes, the subconscious thing. And just to briefly mention it, because Richard already did yesterday, but you have, say, a world here where you've got that backing grid, the sort of yellow grid, is fixed. And what I mean by static, not that it's just planted there and as you turn your head it moves with you, but it's planted there and as you turn your head, that's its only motion, is to move around as if it was part of the world that you're actually physically standing in. And then all the other content can kind of roam around, do whatever it likes. As long as you've got that thing to latch onto, that static background to latch onto, then you feel the world's moving and you feel happy. So not every game can do that, of course. So you've then got, can you have a static foreground? Would that help? That's probably easier to put in games. And I guess in the sort of many demos and prototypes I've done, it does have some benefit, and it depends on the content as well. I've seen it work very well in some games, but generally you have this feeling that the world, that this static foreground that you've put there is kind of moving with you on this crazy ride, so not so effective. Again, briefly to mention, having a representing acceleration of what's happening, so particularly head control, is very useful, particularly sort of games where any acceleration is controlled by a head movement or a head tilt. So if you're moving forward, accelerating forward in the world, in the virtual world, if you can have that triggered by you tilting your head, then suddenly there's a component of gravity that's kind of substituting for the force that you expected to feel. And okay, it's not the right force, but it's just enough for your brain to kind of put a tick box and think, yeah, that's okay, I'm happy with that. Works very well. Another thing you can do is to keep your accelerations brief. Something that I've, if you can make it so that it's very short-lived, so if you really have to accelerate, let's just do it, get it over with, and finish it. I've kind of found, in about half a second or something, if I do a movement, it's almost too quick. This needs to be confirmed, but it's something I've found that really seems to help. Can you avoid the acceleration? Can you teleport to where you're going rather than having to whiz the player over there? Can you hide it completely? Can you fade out to black? So a few things to do there. And another thing we found is very helpful is if the player feels in control of a game and they know what's coming, particularly if they've played a while, they've acclimatized to a game, they kind of sort of fill in the extra accelerations. And I always think of this when I'm at the airport, actually, and I go on one of those walkways, the sort of moving walkways, and particularly the broken ones, the ones that just aren't working. And as you walk up to it, I don't know whether you've ever had this, you walk up to it, it's stationary, you get on it, and you feel this huge sort of lurch of what, and it's like, there was no reason for that. You just walked from one solid bit of ground to another solid bit of ground, and yet your brain is expecting something, and it's filled in the blanks, it's filled in a force, and it wasn't there. So you feel discomfort from the absence of it. And I feel it's kind of like that with the more control you have, the more you can sort of substitute in and not feel sick. So something else, again, it's a theory of mine, but it kind of seems like it works from the demos that I've done. It seems to be important in what your brain's perception of what's real and what isn't. So I can actually contrive cases where that static background that I talked about as being so useful, if you make it so that that static background is so unreal or lacking in reality in comparison to perhaps a visually stunning foreground, you can annul the effects of it. It's almost like your brain is saying, well, okay, I see that static background, it doesn't look right, I think the real world is here, it's moving around crazily, so I think I am too. But having said that, if you can break that case, with a very contrived case, I mean, you have to work pretty hard to break that one, break the static background. But perhaps you can do the reverse for the foreground. So if you can, you've already had your brain deciding the foreground's moving with you. But if you can increase the reality of that, make it very graphically rich, and decrease the sort of realness of the sort of more nauseating backdrop, then you can suddenly then make your brain be more happy with things. It's one example I did here where the picture you've got there is, it's not the most visually rich foreground, so sorry about that, but the idea was that you have this foreground where that was all static, and then everything's sort of in a TV, and I decided to sort of make that as unreal as I could, the actual game within the TV. So I made it a lower frame rate, I lowered the resolution, I think I even put it as black and white sometimes. And I could even have not quite such an all-encompassing static background as the one you see there. You could actually just have a very light static foreground, very light static foreground. And then that would, it's amazing what I could throw the player around in the sort of unreal, undulating world within the TV. So it's just something to think about, things we're working on. Another thing I've noticed that if you break immersion, if you kind of take away the reality of a situation, and this is not great, by the way, but this is just something to bear in mind. We've seen developers do that sort of stutter turn where you, in order to avoid the nausea of sort of smoothly turning, they kind of jump across. And it's almost like every time you jump, your brain's saying, not real, not real, not real, because that's not something that happens. So it's a theory, but we're kind of thinking that perhaps there's this trade-off between immersion and nausea, where the more immersed somebody is, the more potential nausea they might feel, and vice versa. If you can decrease the immersion they have, then you might let them get away with less nausea than they would otherwise have had. And I guess I'm thinking of this more in a context of training wheels, how to get somebody into your VR application gently, rather than throwing them into the full, immersive, they might well be able to cope with that, but they might have to get used to it. So maybe you can perhaps diminish the immersion initially, get them into your game, and then unleash the full glory of VR. So a brief mention on kind of unintentional accelerations, so ones that are in there and you didn't really expect to have them there. The first one, tiny movements. This is something that I actually did in one of my games. I had a first-person shooter, and what I wanted to do, I'd just spend a lot of effort on the main gun. I put some nice graphics in there. I showed the ammo, and I really wanted the player to play with it. So outside of VR, this was just a conventional experience. So I used to back the camera out so that I could, as I turned, I could always see this gun that I'd spent so long on. And yet, when that same experience is in VR, it didn't worry anybody on a monitor. But in VR, that manifested itself as acceleration, because it was a slight movement. And as you turn, okay, you weren't particularly consciously aware of it, but your brain absolutely was, and it was feeding in all these signals that there's this acceleration going on, and it doesn't like it. I've mentioned position tracking absence, so that manifests itself as an acceleration. There's also apparent, or the illusion of acceleration, where actually there's no movement going on in your game at all. It's simply the case that you've perhaps got an animating, something going across the screen, there's perhaps some head-up display element, and it's just moving across, and it's just giving you the illusion, oh, I'm moving sideways. And that's, just to be really mindful of those. Have you got any of that content that perhaps doesn't need to be quite that way, or really realize that has the potential for creating this unintentional acceleration and the associated nausea. Something else, I've mentioned IPD and scaling mismatch, so that's something to get right. Not moving your position linearly. We've seen a few people think that might be a nice idea to solve the issue of when you go out of the view cone. So trail off the amount of positional movement until it goes all the way down to 0 at the edge of the positional tracked view cone. Maybe that's a way of solving it. The trouble is, it's not. It manifests itself as an acceleration and nauseous implications. Wrongly combined transformations, I kind of mentioned that. If it's just doing something different than you thought. Also, if you've annulled the position or movement, so you've got your character perfectly positionally tracked, but you've stuck them in some sort of something that's moving with you. And so effectively, your user then feels like all their movement's been taken away. They feel like they're actually static relative to the environment. So you've created an issue for them there. A way of finding, I guess, these unintentional accelerations, you could go near the floor or the wall again, see what's happening. Nothing sort of exposes these sort of movement and something that's wrong and sort of going up against a virtual element in your world. You could try peeling back the layers of your experience. So take out the known accelerations, zero the input from the temporarily from the rift. Just see if you've got anything left. It's quite surprising how much stuff is left, actually, particularly games that are converted from more conventional monitor games. And then, of course, if you've got one handy, a nice susceptible volunteer to nausea is invaluable. If you've got someone in the office who's just that little bit queasy on anything, just pop them in it and see what happens. We don't get to do that so much because Brendan's our best subject, and you probably don't really want to be putting him in, giving him that feeling, not every day. So in summary, the recognition of what makes great VR really is like this very key thing. Just being able to see for yourself, have I got the best VR I can do? Do I recognize the components? Are they all in place? And when you have them, you can elevate your experience to this great new height. And as was said in the keynote speeches earlier, it's once you've seen it, once you've seen everything in alignment like that, you kind of want that forevermore. Having 75 frames a second for DK2 and smooth, just absolutely crucial to presence. And having one-to-one everything, so having your rotation, your position, just as matching as possible with reality. Unless there's a very considered reason. Occasionally, in your particular content, there might be something where you really do need, there's somewhere you can bend the rules where it really does enhance that particular experience, but only with a really, really considered reason. Be so mindful of what your eyes are doing. How comfortable is it? And consider every acceleration. So every acceleration you've got in your game, does it have to be there? Could it be less? I'll do a quick plug for our best practices guide, which has a lot of information about all this sort of thing. So if you can read through that, it's got some great stuff in there. But in general, being mindful of these things and knowing that they exist, knowing they're there to be recognized, knowing the sort of things that can happen is actually a huge step in the right direction, because then you can assess your own product and really get it to be that sort of high level it could be. So thank you for your patience. That was a lot of information. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Yes.
This is basically multiple questions, but if you do a demo and you have people with totally different distance between eyes, heights, and you don't know this lens A or B, what is the most effective kind of rule of thumb how to fit during the demo? Do you have a few different setups?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Basically, the question is, given that everybody's different with the different IPDs and the different eye reliefs, how do you effectively demo something and to cater for all of them? And I guess what we've done is, it's perhaps impractical to have everybody, being measured before they go on. So we use a kind of default sort of central. Hopefully, this is good for everybody. Okay, it's not going to be right for absolutely everyone. Ideally, I guess we would check everybody through, get all their profiles, but there is this kind of average where it's it's not bad. A lot of people fit in that kind of average setup. So I guess that's probably the best recommendation because it's kind of what we do, just for practicality.
What do you do with these lenses, A and B? Do you ask the person if he's inside or why do you have different lenses? How do you make a decision? Lens A or lens B?
To use in a demo? Do you mean? I can't quite hear. I think. Are you saying? Don't worry. Oh, those. I'm with you. I'm with you. I guess we just use the standard ones. You know, in an ideal world, we'd have separate setups, but yeah, there's a lot of variation. Yeah.
You talked a lot about. Thank you. You were speaking a lot about, you know, here's what you shouldn't do because it induces motion sickness or simulation sickness. I got to try the Crescent Bay demos, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone here, but one of the, you know, a couple of the things that were sort of espoused a big emotional response was scale. Seeing things at a scale or being at an edge of a cliff. What are, in your area, have you found any other experiences other than scale or massive distances that sort of cause people to have this emotion and you know, something that's visual, not so much story-based?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of anything that gives you an emotional reaction rather than, because it kind of, you know that your gut is really telling you, wow, that's real. I guess there's different things. There's falling off objects or being on the edge of precipices. I suppose those are the more powerful ones, the kind of inbuilt fear and working with those. Yeah, I guess we're kind of, what we're showing is a good cross-section. We're kind of always looking at that sort of things. I guess it's exciting when we come across sort of those really strong sort of reactions. I guess we're just keen that, you know, we'll get around to finding them, and that's what's great about the community doing everything they're doing, is that, you know, these other things are found by other developers. So
one of the tests I tried was in the movie Inception, they have this city just warping onto itself, and I made just a basic demo with blocks, and I started doing that. But instead of being in awe, I actually felt uneasy because what's up, what's down, it just made me feel sick, and I'm like, oh gosh, that doesn't work in VR. So
yeah, and I guess it's there is so much of that actually, where, you know, we think, oh, that'll be cool in VR, and then you try it and it doesn't work, and the converse is true. You know, you try something and think, well, I'm not sure this will work, and it's awesome. So I guess that's a lot of what we're doing, is just feeling our way through and just, you know, hopefully gathering together as many things which work well, things that don't. But we can never create sort of hard and fast rules because there's so much scope to what can be done. So, you know, we're really interested to see any experiences that come along, and we're learning all the time as well. So there's so many gray areas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It seems like all these life experiences are depending on fear, whereas perhaps we can create experiences more based on pleasure. Things with proximity, things with avatars, things with how things are reacting around you.
Yeah, it sounds good. I'm just trying to think of any that. I guess it's such a strong feeling, the fear one. I guess it's the low-hanging fruit, really, isn't it? Where you do that. But no, I'd love to have, you know, similar reactions on a more positive note. But I can't think of any at the top of my head that we've done. But you know, worth exploring. Yeah.
So you've produced all of these experiments, and you've talked about it. It would be really helpful for me as a designer. I'd love to see the negative cases.
Right.
Actually in the rift, along with a positive fix.
Yeah.
They're so subtle that for me, I'd love to see the before and the after.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was basically asking, you know, can we show you know, not just the good ones, but the path to it, the negative cases as well, as to why. And I really support that, because I think you know, it saves people so much time to see, you know, if we've done it, you may as well see it. And we've also got plans to, you know, we have done all these experiments. We would, you know, as soon as time allows, we want to get them out there. You know, the number of times that I've come close to, right, I just must package all those out and we'll just get them out there. And exactly as you say, it's showing that it's important to show the negatives as well. And perhaps with the talk as well, you've got the recognition of what's good and bad VR. I also want to include examples of, okay, here's it working really well, and now change it so it works badly, and recognize that, and all the different components of that. You start to explode into a whole load of combinations that become a little bit unwieldy. But no, we definitely would like to do that. And as you say, show the bad stuff too, just so people don't go down the wrong avenue, or at least can assess it, and then they can decide, is there some nuance of it that actually does work with their content, and then they can go off and perhaps tweak that. Yeah.
This morning in the Crescent Bay demo, I experienced a lot of warping. I was wondering, is that caused by a wrong IPD, or is this just the side effects of the Fresnel lenses?
Sorry, what was it you were seeing in the Crescent Bay demo?
I experienced a lot of warping, like a kind of a bubble in the middle of the image. If I looked around, things would bubble in and out.
I don't know. Do you know, that does ring a bell, actually. It's possible that was a strange lens. I can't be sure,
okay.
But I have heard that exact bug mentioned in the office. It was something about a lens or a small batch of lenses where exactly what you're describing, it was kind of a bubble that was there. So okay. I think maybe just one of the bubbly lenses has slipped through.
I was just unlucky then. Thank you.
But okay, I guess we're out of time, but thanks very much for your attention, and thank you.